What's up? It's Jen Brown. Welcome back to my channel. Today I want to share with you some of my favorite and most used kind of tips and techniques that I think would be really helpful for anybody who's a beginner with crochet. Quite a few of these are techniques that I use in most projects, if not all of them. And I just thought it would be easier to kind of have this video as a reference. So instead of in every tutorial me showing people who are not beginners, you know, here's how to do XYZ, I can just refer back to this video. So let's go ahead and get into some of the tips. I'll start with, I guess, what I figure is the easiest or the most basic, and we'll kind of work up to the most difficult. So this first technique I'm going to show you is actually about joining your yarn. This is something that I learned really recently, and for anybody that's new to my channel, or if you haven't just seen something where I've said this before, I've been crocheting for over 20 years, and while I don't consider myself an expert, there are things that I'm still just learning. This is something that I cannot believe I didn't know until just recently. So I have learned a new way to tie these together so that the knot is really, really strong, and you can, like, if you're going to switch colors, or if you just have to start a new skein or whatever, you can go ahead and trim your ends as you're going to help kind of save you from having to do it all at the end. So you tie your knot like normal. If you take whichever string is kind of like in the back and make sure that's the one you tie forward, then when you pull that together, I'm sure there's like an official name for this type of knot. Then when you pull on that, pulling on it just makes it tighter. It doesn't want to slip off. And I was doing this the other way the whole time. So you want to make sure you tug it really tight, because if you trim your ends too early before you've tightened it, it will still just fall apart. But then that way I can just go ahead and trim my ends and go about my regular crocheting, and I don't have to worry about that later. Okay, I've brought us really in close here so that you can see this one. This next technique I want to tell you about, again, this is something that I feel like I learned much later on. I guess I had some books and things that taught me when I was younger that when you're trying to decrease a stitch, like if you're making a hat or just like a skirt or just something that needs to have your stitches decrease, that you should skip a stitch. And when you do that, so when you skip over a stitch to decrease, it can create these like big kind of gaps, because obviously you've skipped over a loop, and they can be, obviously with this is just like a little swatch, so it's not that big of a deal. But sometimes in my projects, these areas where I've skipped can become a much bigger gap that you don't want in your piece. So instead of that, what you can do is what I've seen most places called like just 2 stitches together, where I'm doing single crochets right now. So instead of skipping over this stitch, I'm going to combine these 2 stitches together. So a normal single crochet is just insert hook, yarn over through the first, and yarn over through the second. So in order to combine 2 stitches, we would insert hook, yarn over once, then insert your hook into the next stitch, yarn over once, and then yarn over through the whole thing. So now when we continue on our way, there's no weird gapping. And again, this yarn, since it's quite thick, is pretty forgiving, but I have found that with thinner yarns, the gaps are a lot more obvious. Okay, so for this next one, I want to show you how to crochet down the side of something. It looks, I think, a little bit more intimidating than it really needs to be, and honestly, I probably don't do it the exact same way every time. It's pretty forgiving though. I find that as long as you're not getting wild with it and putting way too many stitches in each one, you'll be fine. So again, I'm going to use a different color here to kind of help be able to see it better. The end of my row here. Slip stitch. So basically the way to figure this out, I've got some rows here of single crochets and then a couple row of double crochets just because I wanted to show you how to figure out the difference. Basically you're just trying to compare the width of one stitch, how that would apply to the side. So for a single crochet, I will usually do 1 stitch per row. So this first row has a nice loop on the side. So I'll do one there. Then we can see a loop here for the second row. Then for a double crochet, I would do 2, and you can kind of see there's 2 sort of chains right there. And it's a nice, evenly spaced edge we're getting. Now, some people might want to do it instead of these 2 like I did. I did these 2 stitches. I know some people might want to do this area in between, or the gap in between the row, or come around the back and use this loop. That doesn't really matter. That's what I meant by it's kind of forgiving about which loop you use. It's more about the spacing. So now we have this nice little row down the side of our project. Basically, as long as you're not doing every single loop where it starts to look like this and get kind of lumpy, that's all you're worried about when it starts to stretch out your project too much. So for this next technique, this is one, like I said, that I use probably almost every time in some capacity, and that is ribbing. Sometimes this is also called an elastic stitch. This is also what you can use to make your projects look really like knit work, or like a store-bought knit sweater if that's what you're working on. So I'm finishing up right here just a row of single crochets, and I'll show you 3 different ones is what I'll show you that I use. So to do any kind of ribbing, all you're doing is working in back loops. So any kind of normal crochet project, you're either crocheting in this front loop, or I know some people put their hook through both of these loops in the top to do a like standard stitch. To do ribbing, we're going to be working in the back loop only. So when I do that, so when you've done your back loop stitches, it makes this like little pyramid shape. So when you turn your project, and you usually only have to, normally I would chain 2, I only chain 1 for a single because we're trying to have it like sit tighter to the row below. So that starts to create this kind of 3-dimensional zigzag pattern, like you would see on a sweater cuff. So this is with single crochets. So we have a row of half double crochets. We're going to chain 1, and then we will do a row of slip stitches. Now these are important to keep your slip stitches really loose. Otherwise it's going to like scrunch up your whole project, and you don't want that, obviously. 7, 8. Then we'll go back to half double crochets. And that gives you that kind of ribbed look, especially if you do it vertically like this. So these two are what I use this a lot of times for just any old sweater, but for cuffs, for things, or the neckline of something. But if you really want to get what they call the elastic stitch sometimes, where if you are doing like the waistband of a skirt or something, or shorts or something like that, that you really want the maximum amount of stretch and for you to be able to have it like really fit on your waist like elastic, you would do slip stitches only. I will warn you, it takes a really, really long time. Slip stitches are the smallest stitch that you can do. And the thinner your yarn is, the longer it's going to take. I did a project once that was mostly slip stitches, and it took forever. But if we back loop only slip stitch, that looks like it's only 2 rows, but it's really 3 because I've done an extra row back there, and the longer I get this, the more that can stretch in between there. So those are a few options for doing ribbing, and the last thing that I'm going to show you is how to do something like this for a hem or a cuff or for a neckline. Okay, so now for this last one, we are going to pretend that this is the hem of a sweater or the sleeve or just whatever it is that I'm trying to put an edge on. Now, my kind of first instinct when I first started making wearables, which was a year and a half, 2 years ago, was to think of it like sewing. And if you've ever sewn anything, sometimes you would kind of create this long tube that would be your hem, and then you would attach the two together and have a seam, and you'd have a nice, okay, here's my sweater, here's the ribbed edge. But the reason that doesn't work is because if you've just done this nice stretchy, whether it's ribbed or not, you have this nice like stretchy piece to work for a waistband or a sleeve cuff or something like that. However you join these two together, when they're separate pieces, you lose a lot of that stretch. And if it's a baggier sweater, sometimes that wouldn't matter, but I found especially like when I'm trying to create a neck hole for something, if I'm doing a mock neck top or a turtleneck, you need that stretch, obviously, because you need it to go over your head. So instead of creating two pieces that you then stitch together, you want to kind of combine two of the techniques we've already talked about, going down the side of a project and creating this at the same time. So I'm going to take this out so I can show you, and you don't have to do ribbing for cuffs and that sort of thing. That's just what I like to do. So I'm going to join at the corner. Then I'm going to stitch however many chains tall I want this to be. I don't always count stitches, but I find that when I'm doing this, I usually have to. It's just easier for me to keep track of. So now what we're going to do is be attaching this to our project at the same time as we're building it. So we're gonna attach to the base with a slip stitch. Then we need to start our next row of the white part. So we're going to slip stitch again, then flip our project. Then we'll do our back loops if we're doing ribbing, but again, you don't have to. Chain one and turn. Come back down. Attach. Another slip stitch to start a new row. And now this is attached and the whole thing can stretch together. Now obviously if I was doing like a half double crochet or double crochet, you would have to slip stitch more than once to join and start a new row. But if this is new for you, I would just start kind of doing slip stitches or single crochets where you only have to do one stitch at a time. So those are my kind of tips and tricks and techniques that I use in a lot of my projects. If you like this video and you want to see more from me, feel free to subscribe. I post 2 to 3 videos a month. Thanks so much for watching this one, and I'll see you next time.